The decision that changed everything. Justin Carter stood in the worn-out hallway of the courthouse, his heart pounding so loudly that he swore the clerks behind the counter could hear it. He clenched and unclenched his fists, willing himself to stay calm as he prepared to take the final step in a decision that had changed his life forever. Today, at 38 years old, Justin wasn't just a carpenter, a lifelong resident of the small, close-knit town of Millfield. Today, he was becoming a father. A single man, a white man, adopting 2 black children. It had been almost 2 years since he found them, Samuel and Amelia, alone, scared, and hungry on the edge of a deserted highway at dusk. They were only 5 and 6 at the time, barely old enough to speak full sentences, yet old enough to know fear. Justin had been on his way home from a long day of work when he noticed them. 2 tiny figures huddled together on the curb, arms wrapped around each other. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he slowed his truck and rolled down the window, his heart shattered at the sight of them. Their clothes were tattered, their faces streaked with dirt, and their eyes, those eyes, held an emptiness that no child should ever have. He had called Child Protective Services immediately, staying with them until someone arrived. Over the following months, Justin couldn't get them out of his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Samuel's fearful stare, Amelia's hesitant grip on his sleeve when he offered her a bottle of water. He had visited them in the group home, brought them small gifts, books, stuffed animals, a wooden birdhouse he had made in his shop. Over time, they had started to trust him. They smiled when they saw him, reached for his hand when he walked in. One day, as he was about to leave after another visit, Amelia whispered, "Can we come with you?" That moment sealed it. Justin had no intention of letting them grow up feeling unwanted. He had made his decision. Now, standing in the courthouse, he was about to make it official. "Mr. Carter." A woman's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to see the adoption officer, Ms. Reynolds, smiling at him warmly. "It's time." Justin took a deep breath and stepped forward into the judge's chambers. The judge, a stern-looking man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, peered at Justin over a stack of documents. "Mr. Carter, you understand the responsibility you're taking on." "Yes, sir," Justin said firmly. "These children will be your legal dependents, and their well-being will rest solely on your shoulders. There are challenges ahead." "I know," Justin interrupted, his voice steady. "But they're worth it." The judge studied him for a long moment, then nodded. He reached for his pen, and with a stroke of ink that felt like a thunderclap in the silent room, he signed the papers. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter," the judge said, closing the folder. "You're now officially their father." Justin exhaled, his chest tight with emotion. He turned to see Amelia and Samuel sitting in the corner, their small hands clasped together. He knelt down and opened his arms. "Come here, my babies." They ran into his embrace. At that moment, nothing else mattered. The joy of that day, however, was short-lived. The whispers started before Justin even left the courthouse. "Did you hear? That Carter boy adopted 2 black kids. What's he thinking? Those kids don't belong with him. I bet he won't last a year before he realizes his mistake." The town of Millfield had never been known for its openness. It was a place where people kept to their own, where generational beliefs ran deep, and where outsiders, even children, were met with skepticism. Justin knew there would be challenges, but he hadn't expected the full force of the town's disapproval. His first taste of it came at the grocery store a week after the adoption was finalized. He was pushing the cart with Amelia on one side, Samuel on the other, when he noticed the stares. At first, he ignored them. Then he heard it. "That ain't right," a woman muttered to her friend, shaking her head. "They need to be with their own kind." Justin's grip on the cart tightened, but he kept walking. Later that evening, as he tucked Samuel into bed, the little boy looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes. "Why do people stare at us, Daddy?" Justin's heart clenched at the word. It was the first time Samuel had called him that. He brushed a hand through the boy's curly hair. "Some people don't understand families like ours," he said carefully. "But that doesn't mean we're not a family. And it doesn't mean I love you any less." Samuel seemed to accept that, snuggling deeper under the covers. But Amelia was different. At 8 years old, she was more aware. She noticed the way people pulled their children away when she and Samuel ran through the park. She saw how shopkeepers watched them more closely when they entered stores. One afternoon, she came home from school and slammed her backpack onto the floor. "Mrs. Carter said I don't look like you, so I can't be your daughter." Justin swallowed his anger. "Amelia," he said gently, kneeling in front of her, "what makes a family?" She crossed her arms. "I don't know. People who look the same, I guess." He shook his head. "No, sweetheart. Family is about love. It's about who's there for you, who takes care of you, who stands by your side no matter what. That's what makes a family." She looked up at him, eyes brimming with tears. "Then you're my real daddy." Justin's breath hitched. He pulled her into his arms. "Yes, baby girl. I am." But the town wasn't ready to accept that. And the more they resisted, the more determined Justin became to prove them wrong. He didn't know then that one day, the same people who whispered behind his back, who sneered at his children, would be the ones standing at his doorstep, their pride shattered, their hands outstretched, begging for the very help they had once denied him. But that day would come. And when it did, Millfield would learn the true meaning of family. The storm that tested them all. The sky over Millfield had turned an eerie shade of gray, thick clouds rolling in like an unstoppable tide. The air was heavy with the scent of impending rain, and the wind carried a biting chill that whispered of something far worse than an ordinary storm. Justin Carter stood on his porch, gripping the wooden railing as he surveyed the horizon. Something didn't feel right. The weather reports had warned of strong winds and heavy rain, but Justin had lived in this town his whole life. This wasn't just another thunderstorm. A storm was coming. And not just in the skies. An unwelcome visit. Inside, Amelia and Samuel sat cross-legged on the living room floor, giggling as they built a towering castle out of wooden blocks. Justin had spent the last few weeks teaching them little carpentry tricks, how to sand wood, how to measure, how to build something solid. It was a lesson in patience, in precision. But before he could sit down with them, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Justin opened the door to find Mark Calloway, one of the town's oldest residents, standing there. The man had the kind of face that seemed permanently carved into a scowl, deep-set wrinkles from years of frowning. His boots were caked with mud, and his arms were crossed tight over his chest. Justin braced himself. He already knew this wouldn't be a friendly visit. "Evening, Calloway," he said, keeping his voice neutral. Mark glanced over Justin's shoulder, eyes narrowing as he caught a glimpse of Amelia and Samuel inside. His lips pressed into a thin line before he finally spoke. "You know that storm's gonna hit us bad," Mark said gruffly. "They're talking about possible flooding." Justin frowned. "Yeah, I've been keeping an eye on the reports." Mark shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Town's setting up an emergency shelter over at the church." Justin raised an eyebrow. He already knew where this conversation was going. "Figured I'd come by. Let you know." Mark hesitated. "You might wanna, keep to yourselves." There it was, the not-so-subtle warning. Justin's hands clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Appreciate the concern," he said evenly. "But I think we'll be just fine here." Mark scoffed. "Suit yourself," he muttered, stepping off the porch. But before he left, he turned back, his gaze flickering toward the children. "Just don't expect people to come running if you end up needing help." With that, he walked off, disappearing down the road. Justin let out a slow breath, closing the door behind him. His stomach twisted, not because of Mark's words, but because he knew they weren't empty. The town had never fully accepted his family, and now, when disaster threatened, They had made it clear they were on their own. A night of chaos. By the time night fell, the storm had arrived in full force. The wind howled like a living creature, rattling the windows and bending the trees until their branches scraped against the roof. Rain pounded against the house in an unrelenting fury, and the distant rumble of thunder shook the ground beneath them. Inside, Justin kept the children close, lighting candles as the power flickered and died. Samuel clung to his arm. "Is our house gonna fall?" he whispered. "No, buddy," Justin said softly, ruffling the boy's hair. "Our house is strong, just like us." Amelia wasn't convinced. She sat curled up on the couch, hugging a pillow tightly. "Are we really all alone?" Justin crouched beside her. "No, sweetheart. We've got each other, and that's enough." But even as he said the words, a gnawing doubt crept into his chest. Because outside, the water was rising. The flood. It happened so fast. One moment, they were safe in their home, and the next, water was seeping under the doors, pooling at their feet. The creek behind their property had overflowed, and the floodwaters were creeping higher by the second. Justin grabbed his emergency bag and hoisted Samuel onto his back. "Amelia, hold on to my belt," he instructed. "We're getting out of here." "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. Justin hesitated. "The shelter?" No, he already knew they wouldn't be welcome there. The hardware store. It was the sturdiest building in town, reinforced with thick concrete walls. "Follow me," he said, leading them into the storm. The wind nearly knocked them off their feet. The streets were unrecognizable, water rushing like an angry river, carrying debris and fallen branches. They pushed forward, step by agonizing step, until the neon glow of the hardware store came into view. Justin pounded on the locked door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door cracked open, revealing Mr. Jenkins, the store's owner. His eyes widened in surprise at the sight of them. "Carter," he said, blinking against the rain. "Let us in," Justin said firmly. Jenkins hesitated. Justin could see the internal battle written all over his face. Then, without another word, the man stepped aside. Desperation and regret. As dawn broke, the storm finally passed, leaving behind a town in ruins. Streets were submerged, homes destroyed, power lines snapped in half. The emergency shelter had taken in dozens of residents, but it had flooded halfway through the night, forcing an evacuation. People were stranded, cold, and terrified. And suddenly, they needed help. Justin, Amelia, and Samuel watched from the hardware store as the first wave of desperate townsfolk arrived, shivering and soaked to the bone. Among them was Mark Calloway. Gone was the arrogance, the disapproval. In its place was desperation. He locked eyes with Justin. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Mark said, "Please, help us." Justin took a slow breath. He thought of all the years of rejection, of whispered insults and cold shoulders. Then he thought of Amelia and Samuel. He knelt down beside them, speaking softly. "Remember what I told you." Amelia nodded. "We're stronger when we show kindness." Justin smiled. He turned back to Mark and the others, stepping aside. "Come in," he said. "We'll get you warm." And just like that, the people who had once shunned them were now at their mercy. A town brought to its knees. The storm had passed, but its wrath still loomed over Millfield like a cruel reminder. Streets were unrecognizable, swallowed by muddy water and fallen debris. Cars lay abandoned, their metal husks half buried in silt. Storefronts that once buzzed with life now stood gutted, glass shattered, and shelves overturned. It wasn't just the homes that had been destroyed. It was the pride of the people. Millfield, a town that had once turned its back on Justin and his children, now stood in tatters. And in its hour of greatest need, the town turned to the one person it had ridiculed. The shelter that wasn't. Word traveled fast. The church, which had been designated as the emergency shelter, had suffered heavy flooding during the night. Families who had huddled together for warmth and safety found themselves wading through knee-deep water as the roof groaned ominously above them. Pastor Mitchell had done everything he could, but without supplies, without power, without heat, the church was no longer safe. By morning, dozens of people had gathered outside the hardware store, their clothes damp, their expressions etched with desperation. And inside, Justin stood at the window, watching them. "Dad?" Amelia's voice was small. "What are we going to do?" Justin turned toward his children, his heart aching. Amelia, now 14, stood beside him, her hands clenched into fists. Samuel, just a year younger, watched from the corner, his face unreadable. Justin let out a slow breath. "We're going to do what's right." Amelia swallowed. Even after they treated us like outsiders. Even after they told us we weren't a real family. Even after they left us to fend for ourselves. Justin nodded. Even after. He opened the door, face to face with the past. The moment he stepped outside, the murmuring stopped. The townsfolk stared at him, their faces filled with something he had never seen from them before. Uncertainty. Mark Calloway was at the front of the crowd, his weathered face lined with exhaustion. The same man who had once told Justin not to expect help was now standing before him, his lips pressed into a grim line. Justin met his gaze but said nothing. Mark swallowed hard. "Carter," eyed we. He exhaled, struggling with the words. "We need help." Justin let the silence hang between them. For so long, these people had treated him as if he and his children were nothing more than a mistake. Now they were looking at him not with judgment, but with hope. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about being better. "Come inside," Justin said simply. There was a visible ripple of relief among the crowd. One by one, they filed into the store. Women carrying children, elderly couples supporting each other, even the same men who had whispered behind Justin's back. Inside, Amelia and Samuel had already started organizing supplies. Justin clapped his hands together. "All right, listen up. We don't have enough food for everyone unless we ration carefully. We'll be staying here until we figure out a better plan. There's no power, but we've got propane heaters in the back. We'll take shifts keeping watch outside." The crowd listened in stunned silence. This was a side of Justin Carter they had never seen before. The leader. A tense divide. As the day wore on, a strange tension settled over the store. People avoided eye contact with Justin and his children, as if unsure how to act around them. Old prejudices don't just disappear overnight. While many accepted Justin's help, there were still whispers, low, bitter voices muttering in the corners. "I can't believe we're relying on him. He's only doing this to make us feel guilty. He shouldn't even have those kids. This whole situation is unnatural." Justin heard them. And he ignored them. Because actions speak louder than words. Samuel, however, wasn't so patient. As he walked past one of the makeshift sleeping areas, he overheard a group of men talking in hushed voices. This wouldn't have happened if the town stuck to its own. One of them muttered. Samuel froze. His fingers curled into fists. Even now, even after everything. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Excuse me." The men turned, startled. "You got something to say?" Samuel asked, his voice steady. The men shifted uncomfortably. They had no problem whispering in the shadows, but now, faced with the boy they had once sneered at, they had nothing. Samuel exhaled sharply and shook his head. "That's what I thought." He walked away. Later that night, he found his father near the storage shelves, checking their supplies. "Dad," he said quietly, "why do we have to help them?" Justin turned, surprised by the question. Samuel looked at him, his dark eyes filled with frustration. "After everything they've done, after everything they've said, why?" Justin set down the box he was carrying and knelt beside his son. "Because Samuel," he said softly, We don't become like them. That's not who we are. Samuel swallowed hard, but he nodded. Sometimes, doing the right thing wasn't about what was fair. It was about breaking the cycle. An unexpected apology. As the night dragged on, Justin barely had a moment to rest. He moved from group to group, checking on the elderly, making sure the children had blankets. Then, out of nowhere, a voice broke the quiet. Justin. He turned to see Mrs. Patterson, the owner of the town's diner, a woman who, for as long as he could remember, had refused to serve him and his children. She wrung her hands together, her face pale. I need to apologize. Justin's eyebrows lifted. For years, she continued, I told myself that what you were doing was wrong. That those kids shouldn't be with you. That you weren't really their father. Her voice wavered. But I was wrong. I see that now. You're more of a father than half the men in this town. Silence hung between them. Justin nodded slowly. Took you long enough. Mrs. Patterson let out a small, surprised laugh. Then, to Justin's utter shock, she hugged him. I'm sorry, she whispered. Justin didn't say anything. He just patted her back. Because maybe, just maybe, Millfield was finally starting to change. A town forever changed. The floodwaters receded in the days that followed. The power was restored. People returned to their homes, but something was different. People greeted Justin when they saw him. People smiled at Amelia and Samuel instead of looking away. People started to realize that family wasn't about blood. It was about love. Justin didn't need their gratitude. He didn't need their apologies. All he needed was to know that his children would grow up in a town that for the first time truly saw them. And that for him was enough. Rising from the ashes, the flood had stripped Millfield bare. Houses that had stood for generations were now skeletons of what they used to be, their walls warped and soaked, their foundations cracked and crumbling. The once bustling Main Street was now a wasteland of broken glass, overturned cars, and the rotting remains of what the water had left behind. But for the first time in decades, the town wasn't divided by whispers and prejudice. It was united by survival. And Justin Carter was at the heart of it. Picking up the pieces. The morning after the storm, Justin stood on the hardware store's roof, surveying the destruction. From this height, he could see the wreckage of the town, the homes lost, the businesses ruined, and the people. They weren't just standing around, waiting for help. They were working. A group of men hauled debris off the roads. Women and children gathered supplies, distributing what little they had left. Even the elderly, the ones who had once shaken their heads at Justin's family, worked with quiet determination, sweeping away mud and broken glass. Millfield was a town that had never wanted change. But change had come anyway. Justin climbed down, rolling his shoulders. His muscles ached from 2 straight nights of no sleep, from lifting sandbags and boarding up broken windows, from making sure every person who had once looked down on him now had a place to sleep. You okay, Dad? He turned to find Amelia standing behind him, her arms crossed. She had always been small for her age, but she held herself like she was 10 feet tall. Samuel was a few steps behind her, hands in his pockets. He had been quieter than usual since the storm, his face locked in an expression Justin had seen only once before, when they were kids, and he had realized the world wasn't fair. Justin sighed. I'm all right. Just thinking. Amelia tilted her head. Thinking about what? He glanced around. About how to rebuild. Samuel let out a scoff. Why should we help? They didn't help us. Justin expected the words, but they still stung. Sam. Amelia's voice was gentle. Samuel's fists clenched. No, we spent years being treated like we didn't belong. Now they suddenly need us, and we're just supposed to forget everything. Justin walked over and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. No, son, we're not forgetting, but we're proving something. Samuel met his gaze, frustration still burning in his eyes. Justin squeezed his shoulder. We're proving that we are better than their hate. Samuel looked away, but he didn't argue. He just nodded. And that was enough. The man who swallowed his pride. The sun was just starting to set when Mark Calloway approached. Justin saw him coming before he even stepped onto the property. The old man walked stiffly, like the weight of the past few days had broken something in him, not just physically, but spiritually. Justin didn't say anything as Mark stopped in front of him. Mark took off his hat, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "Carter." Justin nodded. "Calloway." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. He shifted uncomfortably. "I wanted to say, thank you, for letting us in, for helping us." Justin leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "Didn't do it for you." Mark let out a dry chuckle. "No, I suppose you didn't." He stared at the ground for a long moment before speaking again. "I spent my whole life believing things had to be a certain way. That family looked a certain way. That people belonged in certain places." He exhaled sharply. "And then you went and proved me wrong." Justin raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" Mark nodded. "It is." His voice was quiet, but firm. "And I need to ask you something." Justin waited. Mark swallowed. "Help me rebuild my home." It was the first time Mark Calloway had ever asked Justin for anything. Justin studied the old man. He could still hear the echoes of the past, every sneer, every muttered insult, every cold shoulder. But then he thought of his children, of the world he wanted for them, and he extended his hand. "All right," Justin said. "Let's get to work." Mark grasped his hand, and just like that, the past finally let go. The town that changed. Over the next few weeks, something incredible happened. Millfield became something it had never been before. Justin led the efforts to rebuild, using his carpentry skills to help repair the homes that had been damaged. He taught others what he knew: how to reinforce foundations, how to build stronger walls, how to create something lasting. And people listened. The same men who had once whispered behind his back now worked beside him, following his lead. The same women who had once excluded Amelia and Samuel from birthday parties now brought them food and warm blankets. People started seeing them as more than outsiders. They saw them as family. One afternoon, as Justin finished hammering the final nails into the Calloway family's newly repaired roof, he climbed down to find Mark waiting below. Mark handed him a cold bottle of water. "I used to think this town was better off the way it was," he admitted, "but I was wrong." Justin took the bottle, nodding. Mark looked him in the eye. "You showed us what real family looks like, and I'll never forget that." The words weren't much, but they were enough. A new legacy. Months passed. The scars of the flood remained, but so did the lessons it had taught them. Amelia and Samuel returned to school, but this time it was different. No more cold stares, no more exclusion, just acceptance. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Amelia turned to her father. "Did you ever think this would happen?" Justin smiled, pulling both his children close. "No," he admitted, "but I hoped." Samuel leaned against him. "You were right, Dad." Justin raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Samuel's lips curled into a small smile. "About kindness. It really can change things." Justin chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Amelia giggled. Samuel just rolled his eyes. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Justin knew they had done more than rebuild a town. They had rebuilt hearts, rising from the ashes. The work never seemed to end. Justin woke up before sunrise, his body aching from days of hammering, lifting, and clearing debris. But every morning, he pulled himself out of bed, stretched out his sore muscles, and got back to it. Because this town needed him. The same people who had once whispered behind his back now turned to him for guidance. And while it was tempting to remind them of how they had treated him and his children, he refused to be that man. Revenge was easy. Forgiveness was harder. And Justin had chosen the harder path. Samuel's first stand. Samuel was still struggling. Justin could see it in the way he carried himself. Shoulders tense, hands always in his pockets, his jaw set like he was holding something back. One afternoon, as Justin was reinforcing a wall in the Calloway home, he heard an argument brewing outside. Curious, he set his tools down and stepped out onto the front porch. Samuel was standing in the middle of the street, fists clenched. Across from him was Brandon Myers. Justin's stomach twisted. Brandon had been one of the worst of them, the ringleader of the kids who bullied Samuel and Amelia when they were younger. He had been raised on the same small-minded values that had infected the town for generations. And right now, he looked just as angry as Samuel. "What's going on?" Justin asked, stepping forward. Brandon sneered. "Your son's got a mouth on him." Justin sighed. "What happened?" Samuel exhaled sharply. "I heard him talking about Amelia." Justin's entire body tensed. "What did he say?" Samuel's face darkened. "Doesn't matter. It wasn't good." Justin turned to Brandon, his voice calm but firm. "Is that true?" Brandon crossed his arms. "I didn't say nothing that wasn't true." Justin clenched his jaw. And then he saw something incredible. Samuel stepped forward, not angrily, not aggressively, but confidently. "You know what, Brandon?" Samuel said, his voice steady. "I used to think people like you couldn't change." Brandon blinked, clearly caught off guard. Samuel smirked. "But I was wrong." He crossed his arms. "I mean, if your dad can admit he was wrong about my family, maybe there's hope for you too." Justin watched as something shifted in Brandon's expression. It wasn't immediate, but it was there. Brandon scoffed, shaking his head. But when he turned to leave, he didn't throw another insult over his shoulder. He didn't keep the fight going. He just left. Justin placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son." Samuel exhaled, some of the tension leaving his body. "Yeah." Justin nodded. "Yeah." Samuel let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Maybe kindness really does change things." Justin smirked. "Told you." And for the first time in a long time, Samuel smiled. The invitation that changed everything. 3 months after the flood, the town was starting to feel like itself again. Homes had been rebuilt. Businesses were reopening. But the real change wasn't in the buildings. It was in the people. Justin saw it in the way folks greeted him on the street. He saw it in how Amelia and Samuel were included in conversations at school instead of ignored. And then something happened that he never saw coming. A knock at the door. Justin opened it to find Pastor Mitchell standing there, hands clasped in front of him. The same Pastor Mitchell who had once questioned Justin's ability to raise black children. "Evening, Justin," the old man said, clearing his throat. Justin raised an eyebrow. "Pastor." Pastor Mitchell hesitated, then pulled something from his coat pocket. An invitation. Justin took it slowly, scanning the words. "Millfield Annual Thanksgiving Festival, honoring those who helped rebuild our town." He looked up. "You're inviting us." Pastor Mitchell nodded. The town council agreed. It wouldn't be right to have this festival without the man who saved us. Justin studied the pastor. He wasn't just saying the words because they sounded good. He meant them. Justin smiled. "Well then, I guess we'll be there." A new beginning. The festival was held in the town square, the same place where, years ago, people had whispered and stared when Justin walked by with his children. This time, it was different. As Justin, Amelia, and Samuel arrived, people welcomed them. Men shook Justin's hand. Women embraced Amelia and Samuel. There were no whispers, no judgment, just acceptance. Mark Calloway approached, holding a microphone. "Justin," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, "would you do us the honor of saying a few words?" Justin hesitated. He had never been one for speeches. But when he looked down at his children, he knew exactly what to say. He stepped forward, cleared his throat, and took a deep breath. "I moved to this town thinking I'd live a quiet life, he said, his voice steady. "I didn't expect to become a father, and I sure as hell didn't expect to spend years fighting to prove that my family was real." A hush fell over the crowd. "I won't lie," Justin continued. "There were times I thought about leaving, about taking my kids somewhere that would accept them without hesitation." A few people looked down, guilt creeping into their faces. But I stayed. He looked over at Amelia and Samuel, pride swelling in his chest. "Because family isn't about blood. It's about love. And love," his voice softened, "love changes everything." A long pause. Then applause. Not hesitant, not polite, genuine. As Justin stepped back, Amelia and Samuel hugged him tightly. And in that moment, he knew. This town had finally changed, and they had changed it. The road to redemption. Millfield had changed. Not overnight, not in some grand cinematic moment, but slowly, like a river carving through stone. The town that had once judged Justin Carter and his children was now a place where people greeted them with warmth instead of suspicion, where Samuel and Amelia weren't whispered about in classrooms but invited to birthday parties, school projects, and town events. The flood had taken so much from Millfield, but in its wake, it had given the town something greater, a second chance. And now, it was time to see if that change was real. An unexpected offer. It was a brisk autumn morning when Justin got the letter. It was sitting in his mailbox, an official-looking envelope with the town's emblem stamped on the front. Frowning, he tore it open. "Dear Mr. Carter, the Millfield Town Council formally invites you to join us for a special session this Saturday. We would like to discuss an opportunity for you to become a more permanent part of our community's future." Justin read the words twice, then a third time. What the hell? He folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen counter, rubbing his jaw. "Dad?" He turned to see Amelia, now 15, leaning against the doorway. She raised an eyebrow. "You look like someone just asked you to run for president." Justin chuckled. "Close. The town council wants to meet with me." Amelia blinked. "Wait, seriously. Why?" Justin shrugged. "Guess I'll find out." From behind her, Samuel's voice floated into the kitchen. "If they're offering you a Citizen of the Year award or something, don't take it." Justin smirked. "Why not?" Samuel strolled in, grabbing an apple from the counter. "Because it would mean they're trying to erase the past instead of actually making things better." He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. "You don't fix things by pretending the bad stuff didn't happen." Justin nodded slowly. "You're not wrong, son." And with that, he grabbed his jacket and headed to the meeting. The council's proposal. The town hall was packed. Justin expected the usual faces: Mayor Rodriguez, Mark Calloway, Pastor Mitchell. But as he stepped inside, he saw so many more. Men and women who had once dismissed him. Teachers who had questioned whether Amelia and Samuel belonged in their school. Neighbors who had pretended he didn't exist. And they were all looking at him. Mayor Rodriguez stood. "Justin, thank you for coming." Justin nodded, folding his arms. "What's this about?" The mayor cleared his throat. "As you know, the flood devastated Millfield. And in the months since, we've seen a shift in how we do things." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Rodriguez continued. "You showed us something we hadn't seen before. Leadership, compassion, strength. When we were at our lowest, you didn't just help rebuild homes. You helped rebuild trust in this town." Justin remained silent. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he could feel it coming. The mayor took a deep breath. "We want you to join the town council." The room went silent. Justin blinked. "Excuse me." Mark Calloway spoke next. "We need voices like yours. People who don't just talk about change, but make it happen. You've done more for this town in 6 months than most of us have in years." Justin ran a hand through his hair. "And now you want me to sit on the council?" Pastor Mitchell nodded. "Help us do what you've already been doing, making this town better." Justin exhaled. I don't know. The room waited. He looked around, studying the faces before him. Some of these people had hated him. Some of them had doubted his ability to be a father, to be a part of this town. And now, they wanted his help. He thought of Samuel's words. You don't fix things by pretending the bad stuff didn't happen. Justin nodded slowly. If I do this, I'm not just going to sit in a chair and nod at meetings. Rodriguez smiled. We wouldn't expect anything less. Justin leaned forward, voice firm. Then let's do it. And just like that, Justin Carter became the first council member in Millfield's history to challenge its old ways. Samuel's fight for justice. The first person Justin told was Samuel. His son had grown into a sharp, justice-minded teenager, and Justin knew he would have opinions. So, Samuel said, arms crossed. They finally admitted they need you, huh? Justin chuckled. Yeah, something like that. Samuel smirked. Guess that means I have to step up my game now. Justin raised an eyebrow. Oh. Samuel nodded. There's a kid in my class. Jordan. His family got hit hard by the flood. They lost everything. His expression darkened. His dad applied for disaster relief funds, but they got denied. Justin frowned. On what grounds? Samuel's jaw tightened. They won't say. But Jordan's black. Justin's stomach dropped. This town had changed, but not enough. Justin exhaled. What do you want to do? Samuel's eyes burned with determination. Fight. Justin nodded. Then let's fight. A courtroom victory. What started as a quiet investigation turned into a full-blown case against the Millfield Relief Fund. Samuel didn't just talk about justice. He studied. He researched. He built a case. And when the day came for Jordan's family to have their hearing, Samuel stood beside them. I'm just a kid, he said to the judge, voice steady. But I know when something isn't right. And what's happening to the Johnson family isn't right. The judge leaned forward. And what do you think should happen? Samuel met his gaze without flinching. Give them what they deserve. The courtroom went silent. The ruling came an hour later. The Johnsons won. And Samuel Carter. He wasn't just Justin Carter's son anymore. He was his own name. His own force for change. A town transformed. By the time spring arrived, Millfield was unrecognizable. Not physically, though the town had rebuilt stronger than ever. But in spirit. There were no more whispers when Justin walked through the streets. No more side eyes when Samuel and Amelia entered a store. Because now, they were Millfield. And no one could ever take that away from them. One evening, as Justin sat on the porch, Amelia curled up beside him. She sighed happily. I think we did it, Dad. Justin glanced at her. Did what? She smiled. Made this town our home. Justin looked out at the streets, at the people at the town that had once turned its back on them. Then he smiled. Yeah, he said. We did. The legacy they left behind. The years passed, and Millfield continued to change, not just in ways that were seen, but in ways that were felt. The town that had once whispered behind Justin Carter's back was now a place where his name meant something different, where the color of Samuel and Amelia's skin was no longer a dividing line, but just another thread in the fabric of the town, where love, not prejudice, shaped the next generation. But life, as always, had more in store for them. And legacies aren't built in a single moment. They are carved over time, one act, one fight, one triumph at a time. A father's pride. Justin Carter sat on his porch, the same porch where he had once rocked Amelia and Samuel to sleep as babies, where he had whispered promises into the night about protecting them, loving them, giving them a home. And now, those same children were grown. Amelia stood in the front yard, her long white coat fluttering in the breeze. She was Dr. Amelia Carter now, one of the most respected physicians in the entire county. Samuel sat on the steps, flipping through a folder of legal documents. Samuel Carter, Esquire, an attorney who specialized in civil rights cases, a young man who had already won his first case before he even graduated law school. Justin exhaled slowly, watching them. He had done what he had set out to do. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Dr. Carter's biggest test. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fresh linens. Amelia had been a doctor for 2 years now, but today felt different. Because today, the patient in front of her wasn't just anyone. It was Mrs. Larson, the same woman who had once refused to let her grandchildren play with Amelia when they were kids. The same woman who had once crossed the street to avoid walking past Justin and his children. Now she lay in a hospital bed, weak and pale, her breathing shallow. When Amelia entered the room, Mrs. Larson's eyes widened. You're my doctor," she croaked. Amelia nodded, her face unreadable. "Yes, Mom." Silence. Then Mrs. Larson swallowed. "I don't deserve your kindness." Amelia tilted her head. "Do you think that changes the fact that you need help?" Mrs. Larson hesitated, then tears welled in her eyes. Amelia took a deep breath, all the years of hurt, all the old wounds lingering beneath the surface. Then she chose to be the person her father had raised her to be. She reached for Mrs. Larson's frail hand. "I'm here to save lives," she said gently, "not to hold grudges." The old woman's lip trembled. And then, for the first time in her life, Mrs. Larson saw Amelia for what she had always been. Not that black girl Justin Carter adopted. Not a mistake. But a healer. A woman who had risen above hate and turned it into something greater. And Mrs. Larson wept. Samuel's biggest case yet. Samuel's office was small, but it was his. Stacks of legal briefs sat on the desk, and in the middle of it all was his next case, a case that could change everything. A young black father named Marcus had been wrongfully arrested, accused of a crime he didn't commit, sitting in jail for no other reason than the fact that the system had failed him. Samuel had spent months preparing for this case, and when he walked into the courtroom, he wasn't afraid. Because this wasn't just a fight for Marcus. This was a fight for every kid who had ever been told they didn't belong. Every family that had ever been judged for being different. Every moment of injustice that Samuel Carter had felt in his bones as a child. The trial lasted 4 days, and on the 5th, the judge read the verdict. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Marcus turned to Samuel, tears in his eyes. "I don't even know how to thank you." Samuel smiled, gripping his client's shoulder. "Live your life, man. That's thanks enough." As Samuel stepped out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed him. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to win such a historic case?" Samuel adjusted his tie, a familiar smirk playing on his lips. "I think," he said slowly, "my dad would say that we don't fight for justice because it's easy." He looked straight into the cameras. "We fight for justice because it's right. A town forever changed." Millfield had once tried to keep them out. Now it proudly claimed them as their own. The town square had been rebuilt, stronger than before. And in the very center, standing tall for all to see, was a new monument. It wasn't made of stone. It wasn't just another plaque or statue. It was a park bench, a simple, beautifully crafted wooden bench, built by Justin Carter's own hands. On it, a brass plaque read, "For those who choose love over hate, for those who believe in change, for those who make the world better." And beneath that, dedicated to Justin Carter and the family that changed Millfield forever. A father's final lesson. The last time Amelia and Samuel sat on their father's porch, he was old, but his spirit was as strong as ever. Justin Carter had lived a good life. He had fought for what mattered. He had built something that would outlive him. And as he looked at his children, now grown, he saw something that made his heart swell. A future brighter than the past had ever been. "Did I do enough?" he asked, his voice rough with age. Amelia squeezed his hand. "More than enough." Samuel nodded. "You built something that'll never break, Dad." Justin smiled. "Then I guess my work is done." He leaned back, looking up at the sky, at the town he had once doubted could ever accept them. And for the first time in his life, he felt at peace, because he had won, not with fists, not with anger, but with love. And that victory would last forever.